The day my son-in-law realized my catering company had just been awarded the contract his restaurant group spent 8 months chasing. I watched him set down his wine glass very carefully, the way people do when they're trying not to let their hands shake. That moment was 3 years in the making, but to understand it properly, you'd have to go back to a Tuesday evening in late November. When I told my family I wanted to start a business, and my son-in-law Dennis laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes with his dinner napkin. When people looked at my son-in-law Dennis Folds, they saw success. 41 years old, co-owner of 3 upscale restaurants across Toronto. The kind of man who spoke confidently about food costs and profit margins at family dinners. While everyone nodded like he was reciting scripture, my daughter Camille had married him 8 years earlier in a ceremony at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. And from the very beginning, Dennis treated our family gatherings like board meetings he was quietly running. My husband George had passed 4 years before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After 41 years of marriage, the silence he left behind was the kind that sits in the walls of a house and doesn't move. For a long time after, I simply maintained. I cooked, I cleaned, I attended Camille's children's school concerts. I helped my son Warren with his kids on weekends. I was present. I was useful. I was invisible in exactly the way women my age learned to become invisible without noticing it happening. What Dennis never knew, what nobody in my family seemed to know anymore, was that before George and I had children, before we moved from Halifax to Hamilton, and started the life we built together, I had spent 6 years working as a banquet coordinator for a hotel in downtown Halifax. I understood event logistics, catering timelines, vendor relationships, the precise choreography of feeding 200 people elegantly, without anything falling apart behind the kitchen doors. George used to joke that I could have run a small country with the same calm I applied to a Saturday wedding reception. Then the children came, and the moving, and the years, and that version of me got quietly folded away like a tablecloth after the guests go home. The idea came to me gradually, the way most real ideas do. Not in one dramatic moment, but in fragments. A neighbor mentioned she couldn't find a reliable caterer for her retirement party. A woman at my church had the same complaint about her daughter's engagement celebration. A friend from my book club said she'd spent 3 months trying to coordinate food for her husband's company event and ended up with dry chicken and a bill that made her feel cheated. I kept hearing the same story. Good food was available, professional service was available, but finding both together at a price that didn't require a second mortgage was nearly impossible in Hamilton and the surrounding area. I started making notes, quietly, at the kitchen table in the early mornings, before anyone was awake to ask what I was doing. I researched licensing requirements for catering operations in Ontario. I looked into commercial kitchen rentals. I called an old contact from my Halifax days, a woman named Sandra Obi, who had gone on to run her own events company in Ottawa, and she spent 2 hours on the phone walking me through what had changed in the industry and what hadn't. Those conversations lit something up in me that I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter and more serious than excitement. Purpose. The evening I told my family, Camille had organized Sunday dinner at her house in Ancaster. Dennis had made a rack of lamb, which he always did when he wanted everyone to be impressed before he said something. My grandson Theodore was drawing at the end of the table. My granddaughter Penny was helping carry dishes in from the kitchen. Warren was talking to his wife Bet about their bathroom renovation, a normal Sunday. The kind I had been grateful for since George died. Because normal meant people were still gathering. I waited until dessert, which in hindsight was probably strategic even if I didn't realize it at the time. Something about wanting everyone comfortable before I said something I knew they wouldn't expect. I've been thinking about starting a catering business. The table went quiet in that particular way that isn't really quiet at all. Just everyone briefly holding their reaction. Camille looked at me the way she used to look at me as a teenager when she wasn't sure if I was serious. Warren set down his fork slowly. Dennis, who had been reaching for the wine bottle, stopped mid-reach, then continued, then poured his glass, and then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh immediately. It started as the kind of surprised laugh that slips out before manners can stop it. But then it kept going. "Mom," he said, leaning back and folding his arms. The restaurant business is brutal right now. You know that. You've heard me talk about our margins, I said. I understood the industry had its pressures. He smiled the way people smile when they're about to be patient with someone who doesn't realize they need patience. You're 63 years old. I nodded. I am. Warren cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mom, it's not that we don't think you're capable, it's just, starting a business takes a lot of energy, a lot of risk. I'm not asking anyone to take a risk, I said. Only me. Dennis shook his head slightly, still smiling. You'd be competing against people who've been doing this for 20 years. Established companies with staff and equipment and client lists. He said it kindly, the way you explain something obvious to someone who hasn't quite caught up. You'd be starting from nothing. I know quite a lot about catering, I said, and something in my voice must have shifted slightly, because Camille looked at me more carefully. But Dennis had already moved on to a broader point. He talked about insurance requirements, about the difficulty of scaling, about how many small catering operations failed in their first year. He talked about it the way he always talked at Sunday dinners, filling the room with his expertise until there wasn't much space left for anyone else. At one point, he said, genuinely without malice, that it might be a better use of my energy to do something like volunteer with a community kitchen, which would let me cook without the stress of running an actual operation. Camille didn't disagree. Warren didn't disagree. Theodore kept drawing. Penny brought more dessert from the kitchen and sat back down and didn't know what she'd missed. I smiled and said I would think about what everyone had said. That night I drove home alone on the QEW with the radio off. The lights of the escarpment were visible off to my right, the kind of view I'd driven past so many times over the years that I'd almost stopped seeing it. I sat in my driveway for several minutes after I turned off the engine. The house was dark and still the way it always was when I came home now. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because the story of women my age is so often told as one long accumulation of grief and weeping. And that's not exactly right. What I felt sitting in that driveway was something more like clarity. A cold, quiet certainty that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with knowing myself better than anyone in that dining room had given me credit for. I went inside, made tea, opened my laptop, and kept working. The first months were exactly as difficult as Dennis had implied they would be, and I want to give him credit for that, because it's the honest thing to do. I registered Whitfield Home Catering as a sole proprietorship in January. I rented space in a commercial kitchen in the East End of Hamilton, 3 evenings a week to start. I spent money I had saved carefully over years on commercial equipment, a proper website, business cards, liability insurance, a food handler certification refresher course. I took alongside people 30 years younger than me who were kind enough not to make me feel out of place. My first inquiry came through the website 6 weeks after I launched it. A woman named Barbara Chung was planning her parents' 50th anniversary dinner. 40 guests, her mother's recipes. She wanted it to feel personal and not like restaurant food dropped into her living room. We spoke on the phone for 45 minutes, and by the end of it I had a signed deposit and the genuine conviction that I could do exactly what she was describing. The dinner was on a Saturday in April. I arrived at Barbara's house in Dundas 4 hours early with my equipment in the back of the SUV I'd bought secondhand for exactly this purpose. We cooked in her kitchen together, which wasn't what most catering arrangements look like, but was exactly right for what she needed. Her mother came into the kitchen partway through and stood watching me work, and eventually we started talking, and she told me about her immigration from Hong Kong in 1972 and the specific dishes that still reminded her of her mother. And her grandmother and I listened to all of it and incorporated what I could into what I was making. When the guests sat down and the food came out, Barbara's mother cried. Not from sadness. Barbara called me the following Monday. She'd already given my name to 4 people. That referral became the thing that built my business, not advertising, not social media, not a clever marketing strategy. Just one person telling another person that the food was good and the experience felt human. I understand now that this was my real advantage, the thing Dennis hadn't factored into his calculations. I wasn't competing on price or speed or volume. I was competing on care. And 30-odd years of feeding people you love teaches you something about care that no culinary school course covers. By September, I had 23 completed events on my books. By December, I had hired my first part-time assistant, a young woman named Adriana, who had a hospitality diploma and excellent knife skills, and who called me Ms. Whitfield until I told her 3 times that Lorraine was fine. Camille noticed around October. She stopped by one afternoon unexpectedly and found me at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of vendor invoices, and a booking calendar that was getting genuinely difficult to manage. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she said anything. "You're actually doing it." I looked up. "I told you I was going to." She sat down across from me. Her expression was something I hadn't seen from her in years. Not just surprise. Something more complicated. I think you'd call it reckoning. She asked me questions that Dennis had never asked. What events were coming up? How I'd managed the commercial kitchen logistics? Whether I was finding the physical demands manageable? Real questions, with real listening attached to them. Before she left, she said quietly, standing at the front door, "I should have said something different at dinner in November. I told hers it was all right, and I meant it." Some things people can only see once they've had enough time. Dennis found out through the industry, which feels fitting. A woman he knew through a restaurant suppliers association mentioned she'd hired an independent caterer for her son's wedding rehearsal dinner, and the experience had been exceptional. When he asked the name of the company, she told him. He came home and told Camille that evening, and Camille told me the following weekend. He asked how many events I'd done, she said. I told him. I could imagine his expression. He didn't say anything about it to me directly for several months. At Christmas dinner at their house, which I attended with Warren and Bet and all the grandchildren, Dennis was polite in a way he hadn't been before, which is to say he was slightly more careful. He asked me once, briefly, how the business was going. I said it was going well. Why? He nodded and moved the conversation elsewhere, and I let him because that seemed like the right thing to do. What I didn't tell him was that I had just been shortlisted for a corporate catering contract with Meridian Credit Union's regional offices in Hamilton and Burlington, a contract worth more annually than anything Dennis's restaurant group had landed in its first 3 years of operation. A contact of Sandra Obi's had forwarded my proposal after seeing my work at a charity gala, where I'd managed catering for 312 people during a December ice storm that delayed my delivery vehicle by 2 hours and still received written commendation from the event organizer. I found out about the Meridian contract on a Thursday afternoon in February. Sandra called me first. "Lorraine," she said, "they want you. Full contract, 1 year with renewal option." I sat down at the kitchen table the same way I'd sat down there 18 months earlier with a blank notepad and a vague idea. Only now the table had an actual office set up on it, a proper calendar system, a binder with vendor contacts and insurance documents and employee agreements. Evidence of something real, Sandra was laughing. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "I just need a moment." The moment stretched out longer than I intended because I kept thinking about that Sunday dinner in Ancaster. The wineglass being poured. The patient smile. The explanation delivered to me like I was a child who had asked about something slightly beyond her understanding. I thought about George and how he used to say I could run a small country. Then I called Adriana and told her she was getting a raise. The evening I finally told Camille about the Meridian contract, we were having tea at my house. She went very still when I told her the value of the agreement. Then she covered her mouth with one hand briefly in the way she's done since she was small when something surprises her. "Does Dennis know?" she asked. "Not yet." She looked at me for a long moment. "Are you nervous to tell him?" I thought about that, honestly. No, and the honest answer surprised me slightly. A year earlier, I might have been nervous. Or perhaps not nervous exactly, but braced. Prepared for the familiar weight of his skepticism, which had always been delivered with such confident authority that it had a way of making you doubt your own certainty even when you had every reason to trust it. But something had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, more like the gradual way water wears down stone. Every phone call from a client, every event that came off beautifully, every referral from someone I'd never met who had heard about me from someone else had done something quiet and permanent to the way I occupied my own life. I no longer needed Dennis's assessment of my capabilities. I had evidence of my own. The occasion where Dennis found out properly happened at a Chamber of Commerce spring dinner in April. Warren and Bet were there. Camille and Dennis were there. I was there, which was new, because I had only recently started attending industry events as something other than a spouse accompanying someone else. A woman named Patricia Holst from the Regional Business Development Office came over to speak with me. I had met her briefly at the Meridian contract signing, where she'd been present as a community stakeholder. She congratulated me again on the award. She mentioned that my proposal had stood out specifically for the operational logistics section, which had apparently been significantly more detailed than the other submissions. Dennis was standing close enough to hear this. I watched him process it, not with anger, not with embarrassment exactly, just with the slow recalibration of someone encountering information that doesn't match the version of reality they've been carrying. After Patricia moved on, there was a brief silence. Warren was looking carefully at the table. Bet was looking at me. Then Dennis said quietly, "Lorraine, that's a significant contract." "Yes," I said. He nodded once, took a sip of his water. Then after a moment he said, "I didn't know you'd done work at that scale." And there it was, not an apology exactly, but something honest. I told him I had managed events at that scale before we'd ever met. That there was a version of my professional life that predated his knowledge of me by decades. That George had always known about it and had always believed it would find its way back out eventually. Dennis listened. Really listened, which was something new. On the drive home that evening, Camille rode with me instead of with Dennis because our houses were in the same direction. We sat at a red light near the mountain access and she reached over and put her hand on my arm without saying anything. "I should have spoken up in November," she said eventually. "You've said that." "I know. I keep saying it because I keep meaning it more each time." I looked out at the intersection. The signal changed. I eased the car forward. "I think you were doing what felt safe," I said. "That's not something I hold against you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You never seemed afraid, even when I thought the idea was too much. You never seemed afraid of—" I thought about this carefully before I answered, because it wasn't entirely true. I had been afraid, not of failing publicly, but of something more private. Of discovering that the version of myself I remembered from Halifax, the one who could coordinate a ballroom dinner with the calm precision of someone who'd been doing it all her life, had simply dissolved over the decades. That the capability was gone, even if the memory of it remained. "What I found out," I told Camille, "is that some things don't dissolve. They just wait." The legal conversation happened 6 weeks after the chamber dinner. I bring it up not because it defines the story, but because it's part of the truth, and the truth matters. Going over financial records related to a catering equipment loan I'd taken out early in the business, I noticed something irregular in the tax documentation my accountant had flagged. A filing from 2 years earlier showed a personal guarantor listed on a small equipment lease that George had taken out for a property investment before he died. I hadn't known this lease existed. More specifically, I hadn't known my name was attached to it. I called Sandra Obi immediately, not because she's a lawyer, but because she's the person I trust most, who understands how these things work. She listened carefully and then said what Camille would later say, what everyone who loved me would eventually say. "You need to talk to a lawyer, Lorraine." I did. The situation turned out to be less serious than it might have been, an administrative error on the estate documentation, rather than anything deliberate, and it was resolved through proper channels within a few months. I mention it only because, sitting in that lawyer's office in downtown Hamilton, reading through documents I hadn't known to look for, I felt something that I imagine many women my age have felt. The particular bewilderment of discovering that your own name has been attached to decisions made around you rather than with you. I do not say this to characterize George unkindly. He was a good man who made an administrative error while managing a complicated estate. But the experience left me with a sharper sense of something I'd been developing since I started the business. The importance of knowing exactly what your name is on, of reading what you sign, of not trusting that someone else is managing the details simply because they've always managed the details. I have a lockbox now, not out of suspicion, out of self-respect. Warren came by one evening in June, after the legal matter had been resolved. He brought a bottle of the Ontario Red he knew I liked, and we sat on the back porch while it was still light. He'd been quieter than Camille through all of this, which was his nature. Warren processes things slowly and then says them once, very precisely. He said, "I think I underestimated how much of yourself you'd put away after Dad died." I looked at the garden. The roses I'd planted the first spring after George was gone, which had been a way of doing something with my hands when nothing else felt possible. "I think I underestimated it too," I told him. Warren refilled my glass. "I'm glad you didn't listen to Dennis at that dinner." I smiled. "I'm not sure I was in a position to listen to Dennis at that dinner." He laughed a little. "No, I suppose you weren't. We sat with that for a while in the way people who've known each other their whole lives can sit with things. The moment I described at the beginning of this story, the wine glass set down carefully. The color change in Dennis's face happened at a dinner Camille organized in late August of that year. She had invited the family to celebrate the 1-year mark of the Meridian contract renewal, which I had signed the week before. I hadn't asked her to organize anything. She'd done it on her own. Which, her own, meant something. Dennis had cooked. He was a genuinely talented cook, and I have never disputed that. The food was excellent. Everyone was comfortable. Theodore and Penny were arguing companionably about something at their end of the table. Bet was talking to Camille about a renovation. It felt like a normal Sunday dinner, except that there was a bottle of champagne open, and the occasion was my company. Partway through the meal, Warren mentioned casually that he'd heard through a colleague at his firm that Fold's Restaurant Group had submitted a proposal for a large corporate dining contract with a new technology company moving their Canadian offices to Hamilton. He looked at Dennis when he said it. Dennis nodded, confirming it. "Big opportunity," he said. "We've been working on the proposal for about 8 months. Warren looked at me. Camille looked at me. I set down my fork quietly. I had known for 3 weeks. Sandra's contact had forwarded me the shortlist notification before it became public. Whitfield Home Catering, which was no longer quite Home Catering and needed a new name that I was still deciding on, had been awarded the contract 2 Fridays earlier. I had not said anything to Camille or Warren because I was still deciding how I felt about it. "Dennis," I said, "I should tell you something." He looked at me. I was also shortlisted for that contract. The table went quiet. Not confused quiet this time. Everyone understood immediately what was coming. We were awarded it. The wine glass went down very carefully. I watched his face, not with triumph. I want to be precise about this, because the feeling I had in that moment was not what I might have expected 2 years earlier. It was not satisfaction at being proven right. It was something more complicated and, honestly, more sad, because the man sitting across from me had simply never looked at me long enough to know what I was capable of. And I had spent decades in proximity to people who didn't look, and had quietly arranged my life around their limited vision of me, and it had cost me years I wasn't getting back. Dennis put both hands flat on the table. Then he said, very quietly, "That contract is enormous." "I know," I said. He looked at Camille, then back at me. "You can staff it? Operationally, you can handle that?" "Yes," he nodded slowly. The room was still. Theodore had stopped arguing with Penny. Even the children had picked up on something shifting. Then Dennis said something that I had not expected, and that I think cost him a real effort. "I owe you an apology." From that dinner, in November, Camille looked at him. Warren looked at him. I sat with the words for a moment. Then I said, "I know you thought you were being practical." "I was being dismissive," he said. "There's a difference." Penny, who was 12 and always listening more than anyone realized, said, "Grandma, does this mean your company is bigger than Uncle Dennis's now?" The table broke into laughter. Even Dennis, after a moment. The tension released in the way it sometimes does through the honesty of children who don't know yet to soften things. I looked at Penny. "Right now, yes," I said. She nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood at the kitchen sink running water over the last of the wine glasses. The house was quiet in the way it's been quiet since George, but it didn't feel the same kind of quiet it had felt in those first years. Something had moved through it. A different kind of presence. I had been 63 years old when I submitted that first business registration form. I turned 66 in July, and I remember my daughter calling in the morning, and my grandchildren sending a voice message in the way children do now. and Warren arriving with flowers, and it being an ordinary birthday in all the ways that mattered. I tell this story not because I think I did something remarkable. I don't. I think I did something that women my age do quietly all the time and receive very little credit for. I paid attention to what I knew, took it seriously, and refused to let someone else's ceiling become my floor. What I want you to know, if you're watching this and you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, is that the voice in the room that laughs first is not always the voice that understands the situation best. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can size someone else determine is the size of what you're allowed to attempt. My company has 7 part-time employees now. Adriana manages the day-to-day scheduling with a competence that sometimes makes me feel like I'm witnessing myself at 30, only with better software. We're looking at dedicated kitchen space in the new year. Sandra Obi and I have spoken about a potential partnership for national corporate clients. I tell this in order, beginning to end, because the order matters. The long invisible years matter. The kitchen table matters. The November dinner matters. Not because the hurt of it defines anything, but because you can't fully understand where you arrive without knowing where you started. If you've ever sat at a table and smiled politely while someone has explained your own limitations back to you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, where you are right now. Those messages mean more than you probably realize, especially late in the evening when the house is quiet and I'm still at the kitchen table, still working, still here.